Thank you, Alison, and thank you, Philip, for the invitation to present at this very interesting forum. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So I'm also just going to make a comment. So this is my first attempt with the new UTS branding, and I'm not sure I like it. So I might ask you at the end. As Philip has already pointed out today, pharmaceuticals are a very important aspect of this. So Philip's writing instructions for us were to consider what the great man himself said as our starting point. And I think for me, talking about pharmaceuticals, that was kind of either a gift or a bit of a burden, depending on how you see it, because he had actually quite a lot to say about pharmaceuticals, as we've already seen in this speech. And I've picked out some of these things. So he said a lot of things, as we've heard, about the funding of pharmaceuticals, but also the distribution. And I'm not going to talk about the distribution. I think that will be covered later in the day. So here are a few quotes, and one of them I think we've already seen actually a couple of times. You know, there's only so much in the speech that we can get, which is the one about how much the drugs contribute to the high healthcare costs. The second one is around the importance of quality and precision, and particularly about evaluation. And that's probably what I'll focus on the most. And then the third one, which I'll say a little bit about, or cover a little bit, is the idea of the Commonwealth being in a strong position to force substantial economies and savings in our drug bill. And it's very interesting to have heard just now from Bronwyn about the New Zealand experience, because there are some important features that are different there. But I think we can think about how we could use market powers. Okay, so let me begin by just reminding us a little bit, and I hope this is familiar to everybody, about what the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme covers. So it's, if you like, it was the first pillar of Australia's universal health system. It's the one that's kind of been around for the longest. And its objective is to provide timely, reliable and affordable access for the Australian community to necessary and cost-effective medicines. So there's two things there. There's the idea of value for money and the idea of equity of access. And part of the features of it, as we've heard, is the idea of a fixed co-payment. And Philip's raised the question of whether that should be a fixed co-payment. So when I say fixed, I do obviously mean two co-payments, or more if you allow for the safety net. And I guess one of the things to comment on there is that that is part of the feature of equity of access, that people pay essentially the same price for the drugs regardless of their health need, regardless of the problem, regardless of the rarity of the disease, regardless of the rarity of the drug or the costs of the development of the drug. And so I think that's something that we might want to think about as being fairly important. The other part of equity of access, I guess, though, is the question about access to medicines, and that's where we have some of those other challenges, and I might come back to that later. So the other feature, I guess, is that for new drugs at least, we have monopoly sellers, and the feature of a universal health system is that we have a monopsony buyer. So inevitably there's price negotiation that has to happen, and rejection on the basis of a high incremental cost effectiveness ratio, as PBAC can do, is an effective, but it is a relatively blunt instrument. It has that issue of actually delaying access to medicines, and so that's a challenge. So in terms of implementing value for money and new medicines, I guess one of the things to comment on is obviously, and as we've already heard, so this is well before long after Whitlam's speech, the idea of economic evaluation as a formal requirement. So there was a 1987 change to the National Health Act, and that was actually implemented in 1993. I was interested to hear that Pharmac started in 1993 too. I thought we were the first movers. Perhaps we were on cost effectiveness. So a new drug, therefore, can be listed, and this is essentially what the implications of the legislation are: if it's needed for prevention and treatment and is of acceptable cost effectiveness, or if it's more effective and less toxic than a listed drug and of acceptable cost effectiveness, or it's at least as safe and effective and as similar or better cost effectiveness. Now, the point I want to emphasise here is that the focus for new drugs in the PBS is on purchasing health outcomes. So we're buying health gain. through that process. And implicit in that, implicit in what the legislation says, although the emphasis on value for money, is that a higher price can apply if a new intervention provides additional health outcomes at an acceptable incremental price. So this is a slide that I use, and it's relatively small. I didn't realise the screens would be so small. So there's a lot going on in there, but I'll try and do it fairly quickly. And it's a highly stylised kind of simplified version of what we might think of as going on in the access to medicines market. It's actually not, there's a lot of simplifications in here. But if we think about it, some of the features are that we have a regulated price. So we have the fixed co-payment price, and we might have an asking price for by the producer of the new pharmaceutical. And then we've got a series of negotiation. So a couple of features that I want to highlight is that access really does provide a benefit, okay, because it changes the demand for your drug, okay. And we have to remember price times quantity is revenue, and profit is revenue minus costs. So increasing the access actually increases profits. So it is beneficial, highly beneficial. I guess the second feature is that it's also beneficial to consumers. So we do increase the access to the drug, so there is an increase in consumer surplus. Okay. The third thing, though, is that the taxpayer pays for it. Now, I guess my diagram, it is a teaching one that I use, is a little unfair because I've given a low and a flat marginal cost and a high regulated price. And so the sizes of the boxes mean that it looks like we may be paying well more than the gains here. So it's really about that negotiation. Really, I guess the point is that although we want to get access to medicines in terms of increasing consumer surplus and increasing welfare benefits, we do have to be careful about that negotiation in terms of not transferring all of those welfare gains, so all of the surplus associated with the purchase of health gains, to the provider, the seller of those health gains. So that's kind of the point that I want to make, and I think that's summarised on here. As I said, it's highly simplified. There are two relevant prices, and I guess the key is that we have to make sure that in negotiating that final asking price, the agreed price if you like, that we are sharing the rents, the benefits between the consumers and producers of drugs. All the other points I think I've already made, so I'm just going to pass. I guess the one last thing is that in my stylised diagram, of course, I've got a demand for a drug. But actually what we're actually purchasing is health outcomes. So our demand, if you like, is for health outcomes. And the tricky thing is that we don't really have a clear relationship of the relationship between that demand for the drug and what the health outcomes are that we're buying, which are actually what the welfare benefit's about. And the last point is really just to say that as part of that, because essentially once you've set that co-payment, that's going to determine the demand, but we don't really know who's benefiting and how much they're benefiting. And we can use things like restrictions, but they're fairly blunt instruments to manage whether we're actually paying over the odds for some people in terms of benefiting from the drug. Okay, so some features of the Australian health system or the PBAC system that I might want to highlight is, first of all, I do want to say that I think that the emphasis on cost effectiveness was innovative. Okay, so we were, I believe, unless New Zealand gazumped and I've been under the wrong apprehension all this time, we were the first country to implement cost effectiveness, and we now have nearly 25 years of experience. Some of the points about that is that over that time we've been able to learn from the experience. And I guess one of the features again of our system is that there's no minimum standard in terms of what the evidence should be, but there's a kind of a development of case law, if you like, about what represents a good quality economic evaluation. The other feature, I think that, in perhaps contrast to NICE particularly, I'd say about the Australian system is that the early establishment of that framework within government kind of avoided capture by particular academic perspectives. So we don't, for example, say there's one way to measure health outcomes. We say put your case forward. As you know, read my lips, no fixed threshold for what represents value for money, but we know that there is an implicit threshold that's emerged over time. And the other feature, I guess, is that breakthrough drugs with no fixed threshold tend to exert upward pressure on what that no fixed threshold will be. Another feature is that each submission is considered separately and mostly sequentially. Okay, there's, I guess, if you like, procedural fairness as a feature, but that defines to some extent what can be achieved. And whether that procedural fairness or that emphasis is partly because this policy was developed in the context of also an emphasis on a local industry policy, if you like, and support of the local pharmaceutical industry. So some implications. So previous decisions set the standard for what can, might or should be accepted, and that can lead to inefficiencies over time. So there's a question about first-in-class versus me-too drugs, particularly for chronic conditions, where in the end they are providing an extension to therapy rather than a replacement, so comparing them on a cost minimisation basis isn't really capturing what's going on. The place in therapy may not be clear at the time of evaluation, and that has implications for pricing and whether we should be thinking about how to adjust prices. And there's the challenges of balancing access to medicines with uncertainty about underlying cost effectiveness. So that uncertainty can be resolved with additional data, but it's typically in one direction. The drug isn't quite as cost effective as it looked, but once it's there, it's hard to take it away on that basis. So it's difficult to change the decision. And then I guess the last point, and we've talked already a little bit about this, is that there isn't in this system any mechanism to gain from competition. And so that's why we've seen in the last few years the emergence of price disclosure and other policies to try and get around that. And I think there have been considerable successes there. So what has been achieved through the Australian system? I think it's important to acknowledge that we've developed a sophisticated and a comprehensive approach to evaluation of evidence, and that does provide a mechanism to achieve better value for money. I think that's most common when PBAC has the opportunity to compare across submissions, across models, and across assumptions. So that issue of sequential consideration can be a challenge, and when there isn't sequential consideration, I think sometimes we have better gains. But there are underlying core principles that I think have been accepted, and one of them is value for money, and the other one is the idea of thinking about opportunity cost. So then I guess, and to some extent, Philip's already stolen my thunder from this to say how well this worked. So you saw before the growth in expenditure on pharmaceuticals and the important feature that the introduction of value for money or cost effectiveness seems to coincide with the growth. What this graph does is basically show the growth in the volume of scripts and the growth in real government expenditure over that period. So I guess the point is that it looks like by paying for health outcomes, we really do pay for health outcomes. And we need to be careful about that. Now, it's probably not entirely fair. The fact that the growth in expenditure is much greater than the growth in scripts suggests we are paying more on average. But, you know, there's been medical advance, there's innovation, there are new drugs, there are very different things. But it's a fairly dramatic picture. So the first point on this slide is the one I've already made, that by paying for health outcomes we pay. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the health outcomes gains are real and tangible. So just going back that slide, the last little blip there, I think, is essentially the Hep C drugs. And I think it's such an example of the fact that this is a good thing. We're paying a lot. They are expensive, but we're really buying a lot of health gain. And in fact, I think got a pretty good deal. So that's there. So I guess there's a few things that are relevant here. There's always a lot of emphasis on our role in the international market and how much price is determined internationally rather than locally. There's always the question about whether you need to have these higher prices to provide the incentive for innovation, and there's the thorny question of local industry policy. So the features of the market that are created by the system are important, so we need to think about what are core and what are subject to policy change. So moving forward, I guess There are important opportunities to review the evidence and reevaluate price, and we need to be able to do that. We need to make that part of our system. So really to be able to do the reevaluation, to not make it a once-off and to come back again. What we've seen in recent years is more sophisticated approaches by PBAC and by the government to risk-sharing arrangements. So, for example, managed entry schemes that have got rebates with interest, so that's very much sharing the risk, but also providing access. I think there's really the importance of post-marketing reviews can't be emphasised too much. One thing I really want to highlight is the challenge in our system of genomics, because the emphasis on this comprehensive evaluation becomes so much more burdensome when we're talking about much smaller markets, much more limited data and changes. And I guess there's a temptation in that for providers and consumers to start to seek other ways of funding genomic medicine. So we actually have a real challenge from genomic medicine. And then the last one, and I haven't really spent a lot of this on this, but I think, there's so much more potential through looking at the role of competitive tendering for generic medicines. So price disclosures address some of that, but we could go further. So returning to the 1967 quotes, so looking at the three things. So one other important cause of high health costs is drug costs. I might just mention it's a little bit of an unfair comparison that Whitlam made, because 1960 was essentially the first year that the PBS became more comprehensive, and that's where he saw the doubling of costs. But we have seen that costs have continued. So yes, we have had that higher health cost, but it's associated with gains in treatment. In terms of the question around evaluation, we do have a sophisticated framework and it's offered us a lot, but not everything. And I guess then the last one is the big challenging one of using that market power to be able to negotiate better prices. And while I think we've seen some successes in that, there's more that could be done.